Hello and welcome. My name is Farah Eck, and I'm the Senior Director for the United Nations Association of the USA. And I want to personally welcome you to this very unique installment of the Global Engagement Online Series, or as we fondly call it, GEOS, which today celebrates International Human Rights Day. During today's program, we will be exploring the intersectionality of art and human rights with a special feature of artwork that was collected through a competitive process. You'll hear from two very special guest speakers, Joshua Cooper, who is director of the Human Rights Institute at the University of Hawaii, and who serves as the Universal Periodic Review Task Force co-chair for the U.S. Human Rights Network, and also consequently is a UNA volunteer leader. We'll also hear from Grace Anderson, who is a policy associate at the UN Foundation and who has worked extensively to support US efforts with the Universal Periodic Review. Their bios can be found by clicking on the link in the chat box. And so I just want to mention that while most of the time during today's program will focus on discussion about the gallery of artwork, please feel free to post questions to the speakers in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your screen in a navigation bar. And please also note that the intent of the gallery will be to provoke thoughtful responses to give examples of how the UN works to support human rights in different places and in different capacities, and that the speakers in no way will offer artistic critique or criticism about the pieces. So basically, they're not playing art critics in their other lives. So now let's discuss the question at hand, which is to dig into the role that art plays in human rights and vice versa, from the standpoint of the United Nations and, of course, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR. From the UN standpoint, UNESCO, which stands for the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, defines artistic freedom as that of embodying the following rights, which are protected under international law: the right to create without censorship or intimidation, the right to have artistic work supported, distributed, remunerated, the right to freedom of movement, the right to freedom of association, the right to protection of social and economic rights, and the right to participate in cultural life. You will see all these rights reflected in the various pieces that we will discover together today. And for some of them, you'll even be able to note the particular articles of the UDHR which are represented. But first, let's lay the foundation by posing this question to both of our speakers from their standpoint about what is the role of arts in human rights and how does human rights impact art? So Grace, let's start with you.
Sorry about that, just needed to unmute. Thank you so much, Farah, and everyone at UNA for having me join today's conversation. Really excited to engage in this really unique format. I feel like we have so many Zoom meetings about a lot of different things, but it's really cool to be talking about artwork, especially because we can't visit a lot of museums nowadays. And really amazing to see all the different interpretations of the UDHR and seeing how all the different artists chose to express those interpretations through different artistic mediums. So definitely really inspiring to see this new take on human rights. For me, I think that human rights are fundamentally essential to really allowing each person to fully be themselves and embrace their identity and feel comfortable with their expressing their sexual orientation or religion or race or gender or whatever it may be. But I think human rights is also about empowering people to really express their identities too openly and publicly through freedom of opinion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, really just allowing people to have their voices be heard. And I think that artwork is a really powerful way for people to express those different identities and also their experiences and perspectives while feeling really empowered to send that message and embracing those identities. So I think that only when human rights are really and truly protected and promoted can people really feel comfortable expressing their ideas, which really allows art to flourish. And I think that art is also really fundamental to culture and cultural expression. And that's also another area that is protected under the UDHR. And I think just like art, in that it finds its strength through different mediums and expressions. I think it's also essential to recognize that cultures aren't monolithic or homogenous, but they also find their strength in diversity as well and in freedom of expression. And I think that going back to the UN, the work of the UN human rights system is really just rooted in the mission of really allowing each individual to feel comfortable expressing themselves and living in dignity and equality and justice. So I think that directly and indirectly, the UN human rights system really does play a large role in upholding culture and art and freedom of expression. But then on the other side of that coin, I think that art also reinforces human rights. Something that I love about art is being able to see new perspectives or experiences and hearing the voices of marginalized people that maybe can't be expressed in other ways, and learning about new people and their experiences. But I think it also really helps to cement our history and look back and be able to see how different people express themselves at different periods of time and learn from the past when maybe human rights weren't protected or promoted. So I think that at the end of the day, cultural diversity is a really central part of human rights. And going back to allowing everyone to feel comfortable with their identities and expressing that without discrimination. But also art really pushes us to strengthen human rights even more going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grace. And now we're actually going to start taking a look at some of the artwork. If we can have there we go. Excellent. So Grace, and thank you again for laying the foundation. I know you've had significant experience. You mentioned UDHR, and I know that hopefully you'll be able to weave in some commentary that there are even special rapporteurs who support and uphold the particular legislation and laws in UN member states that protect the rights and again, have some of the benefits that you talked about with art in the role of playing human rights and then vice versa. So let's first turn to, and again, this is going to be the fun part. And I want to provide the disclaimer one more time that both Grace and Joshua are not art critics, but they have taken a look at the artwork and have thought about what resonates as far or evokes some examples, some real world examples that the United Nations is doing, the various agencies are doing on the ground or examples from the past. Because I do want to highlight that human rights are not only enshrined in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but they are supported through the UN agencies, through social justice movements, also very similar to UNA USA, which we are a movement, by activists, but they're also seen in the physical manifestations such as statues, murals, street art, photos, even textiles. And then obviously, of course, we can't forget spoken word and other types of art in the multimedia forms. So we're going to take a look at 7 of those selected pieces, and we're going to ask both Grace and Joshua to comment on them with some of those real world examples that they prepared and from their experience as well. So the first is called Dreamer. You see the image on the screen, and this is actually a production by Lucinda White, who is a UNA member from the UNA Maine chapter. Grace, if you could please respond. Lucinda has provided a description of her piece here and calls it Dreamer and hopeful for the families who have come to America seeking a safer life. What does this evoke for you?
Great. Yeah, I love this piece, and I think it really encapsulates families that are looking for a better life for their children and a more hopeful future. So, as you mentioned, within the UN human rights system, there's a lot of different mechanisms to protect human rights, and one of those are special rapporteurs, which are basically independent experts of the UN that are focused on different areas of human rights. So it really ranges from right to water, protection again of sexual orientation and gender identity, really all aspects of human rights. And specifically, the Special Rapporteur on Migrants helps ensure that the human rights of migrants are upheld. And through his mandate, he's able to look at different situations of concern, either through different country visits or through research reports to the UN. And actually, the Special Rapporteur on Migrants' most recent report to the General Assembly actually focused on child migrants specifically, and also on ending immigration detention of children, which is something we've been seeing more and more of, unfortunately. So in his report, he really goes into a lot of the legal frameworks on human rights that are already in place to protect the human rights of child migrants. And those include things like adequate care and right to shelter and food and due process. But then he also goes into the impacts of detention on children, whether that be through physical or mental health impacts. And then he also goes into some good immigration practices for child migrants and trying to provide some more actionable advice for states. And specifically, he recommends states really shift away from more of an enforcement and coercion take towards immigration, and instead focusing on a human rights-based approach to immigration and alternative care, especially for migrant children and their families. So I think that's really a great example of how special rapporteurs examine issues within their mandate, and also look at emerging issues and responding to human rights concerns all across the world.
Great, thank you, Grace. And Joshua, if you would be able to weigh in from your experience and, of course, working on the UPR, et cetera, in the Human Rights Institute, what does Dreamer evoke for you as far as some real world examples?
Yeah, on an exciting note, even this was in Maine just last night. It's the same picture we have here in Hawaii. Amazing family in a parking lot where we walk our dog, and the same boy is pedaling, and the family there has the same dreams of what they hope for their all children. And that's the universality on this Universal Declaration of Human Rights Day. All these human rights are universal, and it's what all people want for their family. And we just have to think of the family as the family of humanity and extend that circle to everyone. And it's great because, you know, I see the family there every other day biking, and the little boy is still got his tricycle wheels. This one doesn't. This one's moved beyond. And we don't know each other, but we still wave, we say hello. And it's great to see another family coming with 4 children who also want to have all those human rights that are enshrined in the UDHR. It, besides just personal experience of being in Hawaii and walking my dogs yesterday and seeing the family again, that's what I first saw, is it definitely reminds me also of the UPR. We had a side event right before the actual UPR, and we had some of those amazing activists who were on the border documenting the human rights abuses and working diligently to make sure that the human rights would be realized. And I think that's absolutely essential, the role of civil society to get involved. And then finally, I think the other aspect that I think is quite crucial is also the new Secretary General also had experience on refugee rights and never will forget that experience. And I think it really shows that we need to all come together, but from the Secretary General down to even the farthest place, Hawaii, the most isolated islands, it's the same dream that we all have for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all those 30 articles to be actualized and for everyone to be able to achieve dignity and equality and live a life. And it's one of those aspects, right? It's a season now. Even my dog's excited about the holidays. And it's that point that it's the season that we should have throughout the year for peace and justice and human rights for all.
Thank you, Joshua. And it occurred to me that I wanted to encourage our audience members that you too can in the chat box describe what what the art pieces evoke for you as far as human rights. Can you see why Lucinda named this dreamer? So please do feel free to share your thoughts and what UN real world examples or some personal real world examples, as Joshua mentioned, in the chat box. And then, of course, questions can be placed in the Q&A box. So we'll move to our next piece, which is Untitled, but the artist is Max Miner, who also is a UNA member, which is terrific, from the chapter in Orange County. In my illustration, this is his words, I have tried to portray the idea that children have the right to learn, play, and grow in a world that is compassionate and open to them. They deserve to see their home cared for and to learn how to care for it themselves. Human rights allow all people to experience the full wonder of our earth and the joy of interacting with its inhabitants with freedom and respect. Grace, would you like to go first to tell us what pops for you first when you're looking at this image?
Yeah, this one definitely made me think immediately of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and especially the description that talks about the rights that children have. So the CRC is a human rights treaty, and those are another mechanism of the UN human rights system. And basically, any state that has ratified a human rights treaty is actually bound to its provisions by international law. So they're one of the strongest ways to hold states accountable to human rights. And so the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as the name would suggest, is all about the human rights of children. So they protect those human rights. They also specifically work on allowing children to live without any sort of discrimination or violence or neglect in their lives, really to live in safety and dignity. And it also really promotes a right to education and making sure that children's futures are as bright as they can be. And actually last year, the CRC celebrated its 30th year. So it's been around for a long time. It's also one of the most widely successful human rights treaties. In fact, every country in the world has ratified the CRC, except unfortunately the US, although it has ratified a couple of the protocols that are associated with the CRC. But really one of the most successful human rights treaties in the UN human rights system. And a couple of the topics that they're working on right now are ending child marriage, also making sure to end child poverty, again, making sure that children can achieve their greatest potential, and then also increasing the number of children in schools and making sure they have a full education. So at the end of the day, the CRC really works to hold those states that have ratified the CRC accountable and really make sure they're protecting and promoting the human rights of children in order to really protect the next generation.
Thanks, Grace. And Joshua, turning to you, there's a young boy peering down at Earth in this image. What does that mean for you? I think you may be muted. There you go.
For me, it reminds me really of that Marvin Gaye song. He's looking down at that earth and he's saying, "What's going on? What's going on?" And then that song, of course, is remixed by Four Non Blondes, and it's more of a different version of "What's Going On," and she's raspy. And then Bono just came out with the 2010 remix of "What's Going On," and I think it's some of the same questions, looking at the world, saying, "Why is it the way that it is when it could be so much better?" And that's my initial reflection of I could just see a kid going, "What's going on?" And then on the other hand, the other one that comes into my mind is I was fortunate enough, since Grace mentioned the Convention on the Rights of the Child, my last traveling of 2020 was at the 84th Extraordinary Session in Samoa. And there was the first time that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child left Geneva and met in the community, in the region. And there they reviewed 4 countries. And that was just amazing to see that. I mean, it was growling good to see so many countries from the Pacific being able to participate. But the other amazing part was moving behind tokenism towards transformation. The youth there from Samoa, over 100, attended the entire week. And it was amazing to see it in Samoa because it made me think a little, we have so much work to do in the US because it was front page news the entire week. Everyone's talking about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the kids moderated the panels. And the children studied the CRC before they came. So the whole island was talking about children's rights. And it's really what we can do and why we should ratify that important instrument, because it should be in every classroom, the CRC, and it should be there with the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the UDHR that we're celebrating today. And so I think of all that when I see that. And the children that I met there were amazing because once they were included and involved, they wanted to discuss the solutions to climate change. They wanted to discuss what's going on that they see in Samoa that we see around the world. And for them, climate change is an existential threat. It's life and death. And there's no reason that we shouldn't take action so that every boy there looking would be able to see that the world is there for them. And the last one I think of is Fiji. I was playing marbles with a little child in Fiji before we went out to explore a Chinese corporation doing black sand mining that we were able to stop in 2020. And was so cute. I was worried about the boat wasn't there yet. And the little child was playing marbles the same way I used to hold marbles in Waianae, in Hawaii, and with the same finger. And I was sitting there like, why am I worried about when the boat will get here? This child has the same, marble technique I have. So I think the world's that big blue marble. There's a great Hawaii activist named Hank Rogers who created Tetris. And if you meet him and he likes you a lot, he gives you a little marble of the world. And it's one of those things that you carry in your pocket, and a lot of people enjoy getting them. But I think it's what's going on really sticks out to me, and it's really an honor to participate with Grace.
Joshua, that's in and of itself, that's a great artistic perspective on this piece by Max Miner. So terrific. And I see the chat box is alive and kicking with audience responses to the piece. So that's amazing to see. So please keep it coming. And if you have questions, again, if you want to ask Grace or Joshua some questions for later on, please pop them into the Q&A box. And so for our third piece, we will actually be able to have the artist present the poem, My Headscarf, and Shirzad Mustafa is here with us. And I am, please start the video. I will read the description. I was inspired to write about this when a Bangladeshi Muslim woman was criticized for playing cricket with her son while wearing a burqa, which is a type of clothing to cover her from head to toe. She was criticized by both liberals and conservatives, some for wearing the burqa and others for playing cricket in public. So without further ado, Shirzad, if you could present to us My Headscarf.
Let's judge my scarf. Feminist scar. Just asking for it, a fanatic's war. Subservient and weak, these sister wives, begging to be rescued from meek lives. Feeling superior now? Let's weaponize my scarf, then. Get it banned, crusade father, heckled and yanked, media circus, talk up a storm. Uncivilized scarf can't be the norm. More to your liking? Let's look at my scarf, my head's adorned. Light pastel softness, not crown of thorn. All pride, honor, modest grace. Elegant beauty, confident in my space. Maybe that's what you had in mind. Let's consider my scarf, how this is my choice, my identity, security, my voice. All ambition, talent, and kindness. Wonder at my strength, my smartness. Perhaps this is my right.
Thank you, Shirzad. And we have the unique opportunity that if you have questions for Shirzad about this particular piece, please also feel free to pop that in the Q&A box. But in the meantime, Joshua, let's start with you and your reaction to hearing Shirzad and the poem about My Headscarf.
It always asks me to unmute myself. it's one more challenge in the world today, but we will speak and be heard. And so the first one is I think what many women feel, and no matter what you do, it's going to be criticized. So what's most important is do what you believe in anyway, because women, no matter what they do, are attacked on both sides. And I think that's a powerful message. The second one I think that's really powerful is also women's right to choose and choice. And I think that's absolutely an essential element of that. And we saw, unfortunately, the US under now the former administration making a Geneva Declaration denying women the right to choose, and also weakening family planning and the important aspect of reproductive rights at the most recent, just a month ago before the UPR. So it makes me think of all those aspects. And then I was just on a meeting and I just finished a new logo for Symbols of Freedom. And it actually had a scarf, but it was a scarf also worn by the women of the Plaza de Mayo of Argentina around enforced disappearances. And the speaker just shared that it's the presence of that mother, the bravery of that mother coming and standing there before even a dictatorship saying, I deserve to know what happened to my son and my loved one. And so I think there's many scarves, and that I think we should be able to identify ourselves as we want to, but each one of those scarves is powerful because it is the identity of the individual, and it shares also what we look at human rights. On Human Rights Day, it's also the first day of Hanukkah. It's also the season where everybody's decorating for holidays. It's the season of joy, and that's an important aspect, is we must recognize and respect each other's spiritual beliefs. And I think that's one of the things that was also in the four freedoms, is freedom of speech and freedom of worship. And my puppy agrees with that wholeheartedly, thinks freedom of worship is absolutely essential. And what I really think, it's important for us to respect each other's choices. And that's the important part, to listen to each other. And it's such an honor to have Shirzad with us as well as we're doing it. So what a great event. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua and Joshua's dog. Grace, let's turn to you, and then after Grace, then I'd love to have Shirzad provide us with a little bit more context too. But until then, Grace, your interpretation.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Shazad. It's a beautiful poem. And I think my favorite line is about how her scarf is her identity and security and voice. And I think what Joshua was saying about identity definitely resonated with me as well. But I think what this poem really shows to me is that there can be different forms of identity, and also that can intersect with each other. And there can also be intersecting forms of discrimination as well. And I think that in the poem, it's clear that this woman faces challenges due to her gender, but also due to her religion, and those kind of compound each other and can make the other even worse sometimes as well, in terms of human rights violations. And yeah, as Joshua said, freedom of religion and gender equality are both enshrined in the UDHR and are high priorities of the UN human rights system. There's the Special Rapporteur on the freedom of religion. There's also the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is another treaty body. There's also a working group on discrimination against women, which helps to eliminate discriminatory laws. So a lot of different areas of the UN human rights system focused on these issues, but a lot of the times these also overlap with each other as well, especially when it comes to intersecting forms of discrimination. So for example, the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion, his most recent report to the Human Rights Council actually focused specifically on freedom of religion and gender equality and how those intersect. So he talked a lot about gender-based violence and discrimination that is all too often perpetrated in the name of religion. And he specifically focused on gender-based discrimination laws and encouraging states to repeal those, and also just advancing non-discrimination and freedom of religion, especially as it relates to vulnerable groups, including women and LGBTI persons. So I think that this really echoes a sentiment that's clear in the poem, that individuals have a lot of different layers to their identity, and those can sometimes create compounding forms of discrimination. So it's definitely important to use an intersectional lens when the UN human rights system is really working to protect and promote human rights for all people, no matter what their identity is.
Thanks, Grace. And now, since we have a special treat of having the artist join us, Shirzad, if we could have you briefly share what inspired you to write this piece and share it with us on International Human Rights Day, and maybe even to briefly provide a bit of context about the Bangladeshi Muslim woman that the poem is about.
So I was inspired by a lot of things. One of them being that picture, and the thing is, this picture had a lot of impact on me because it was a mother and a son, and I think I have a very great relationship with my mother, and she has taught me many things and encouraged me to focus on my interests in human rights and international relations and all that. And this picture also stood out to me because um, it's something that's not considered normal, and it's not considered normal in in countries like the U.S., countries in Europe, and this mother was like being ridiculed and being kind of like torn apart by both sides of the media, and I thought it was like very unfair. And I've also seen this like at the local level at my school, like we talk about like, hey, we should focus on women's rights, freedom of choice, but then we have like students who are like, women should not wear a burqa, women should not wear head coverings because it's oppressive. And people really forget that the freedom of choice applies to every person, right? Like that you have the freedom to wear what you want, and if and to continue believing in your religion as long as it doesn't harm anyone. And in reality, the wearing a scarf doesn't harm anyone at all. And yeah, like I've seen that certain individuals will be extremely hypocritical, and they'll only believe in the freedom of choice when it only is important to them, but not like important to everyone else. And yeah, a lot of things inspired me to write this. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for being a part of our event today, and for bringing this to the forefront in a very interesting and artistic way. So we will move on now to our next piece, also untitled. This is a sketch drawing by Gina Damasco, who is also a UNA member from Northern New Jersey. And you'll see here the brief description inspired by Madame VP-elect Harris, standing her ground during the debates. That's reflected in the I'm still speaking verbiage on her mask. And also of her niece when she was 3. I think about how too many people are fine saying full gender equality globally by 2030 is just a pipe dream. So Grace, let's start with you. What does this image evoke for you?
Yeah, so I totally agree that I think we really need to stop thinking that gender equality is just a theoretical concept and is something that's never going to be achieved, because I really do believe that when everyone from all different sectors works together, it's definitely something that we can achieve, and by 2030 as well. And so I usually try to remember that even if it seems like a big challenge, SDG 5 on gender equality was unanimously agreed on by all UN member states. So even though it might seem like a pipe dream, every country in the world has already agreed that this is something that they're working towards and believe is possible. So I think that even though we've seen that COVID has also highlighted a lot of gender disparities, and it's also exacerbated gender inequality a lot, whether that be in the healthcare sector, where we see more women, doctors and nurses vulnerable to the virus, or at home, where we see domestic violence levels really skyrocketing, and also a greater unpaid care burden on women as they work from home more often. It can be kind of a depressing backdrop, but I think that this picture really shows that there's hope for the next generation. So what this makes me think of in terms of the UN is actually that UN Women is currently organizing its Generation Equality Forums in 2021. So those are really intended to be a follow-up to the Beijing Declaration and platform for action in 1995. And that was really the most ambitious agenda that set forth gender equality in all different aspects of life. So the Generation Equality Forums are really intended to be a follow-up to that and are bringing together all different parts of society, whether it be civil society, governments, the private sector, really bringing every perspective together to take stock of where we are on gender equality and how we've been doing on that goal, but also charting a more ambitious path forward and trying to be even more ambitious. So another key part of that is also the intergenerational aspect, as the name Generation Equality would suggest, and really making sure that the gains that were made in Beijing 25 years ago and that the previous generation really charted aren't lost and are continued to be pushed forward, and making sure that there is a knowledge transfer between generations, and but also really making sure that we're being even more ambitious and bringing in more stakeholders and creating more inclusive change to make sure that we can achieve gender equality by 2030. So I think that this picture really gives hope that the next generation can really work to achieve gender equality, and we can all work together to achieve that goal.
Excellent, thank you. And Joshua, what does this sketch of a young girl wearing a mask that says "I'm still speaking," what does that say to you?
Well, to connect that with Shirzad's comment, I was also fortunate enough to be raised by my grandma and my mom. And that really framed my perspective. And that really, I think, shows that we must all be feminists. And looking at this, was also a thing that came to my mind is even with the mask, you can still speak. So you could always put that message out there. And I think that's very powerful. The other aspect is it inspires me about all the work being done by UNA chapters around the country, bringing CEDAW to the local level and adopting CEDAW, because as Grace brought up, we're the only country to not ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there's a handful left in the world that haven't ratified CEDAW. And we must make that a priority. And that should be a campaign we do leading into this UPR adoption. Many countries, over 35, gave us recommendations. That was based on a lot of the recommendations of UNA chapters drafting interventions for. And he totally agrees with that. And so I think that's very important. But also I think it's exciting that art is now really growing and raising the hypocrisy that exists when how women are always being denied their voice and how men are speaking over. And it's one of the things that also made me be very aware in all the work that I do. So I actually do that sit back, don't a lot of times. So it's even helped me to be better. And then the other example I thought besides I'm still speaking is nevertheless. So the nevertheless, she persisted. And you saw that a lot with Elizabeth Warren's objections to confirmation of Sessions as US Attorney General. And then that was then everywhere. It was nevertheless, she persisted and persists. And that became like on every t-shirt around New York in the Strand bookstore. So I think more and more now AOC has a couple of logos around this as well. So we're starting to get the voice of women from every generation. And I believe having a Vice President Harris will definitely also do even more, and we'll take off the masks that have been silencing too many and challenge patriarchy as well. So I think it's a beautiful drawing.
Excellent. Great rendition of incorporating some of the subtle politics, but also some of the laws and regulations, or some of the also customary, unfortunately customary practices by men versus women. So let's move now to our next piece. And this is actually a video that we'll take a look at.
Justice, no peace. No 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 justice, no peace.
Freeze! Look behind me. Can you name what you see? I can. A group of Black and white Americans fighting for me, fighting for you, and fighting for that person that may not look like you. Their skin color may be different than yours, and their hair texture may be thicker than yours, but you see it's us as a whole. One race, the human race, in different ethnicities. We're the ones they protested for. Unfreeze.
No justice, no peace. 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 No justice, no peace.
Okay, pause. Can you tell me what you heard? I can. Shouts of no more segregation. They were in preparation for no more separation. They were the ones ready to welcome integration. They didn't just speak of change. They acted on it. Carrying cardboards and round sticks with words that shook our nation. No more segregation. Unfreeze.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no
Freeze again. It was these words that carry so much power, so much meaning. They wanted to sustain it, change it, make it look like a rebellious act. Called them rowdy and asked, who gave them the right to speak? Rich ones called them wild and said, make sure you keep them away from me. But isn't it our First Amendment right, the freedom of speech or the freedom to speak? Without their voices, there would have never been a change. You see, it wasn't a protest they wanted to end. It was their passion, their hope. Hope is the only thing stronger than fear. What is there to fear when there is hope? Hope for a nation that would recognize we all bleed the same blood. Hope for a nation that will finally call us equal. Hope for a nation that we have today. So you see, we may not be 100% perfect, but at least we're not the same way we were in those days. Because of their protest, there's been a change. Because of their protest, there's been a change. Because of their protest, there's been a change. So shout out to the protesters who put their lives on the line and hope for a better nation. We're the ones living their dreams with no more segregation.
So while the video is a bit unclear, I think what is clear is definitely the focus on human rights. And this is a piece that Sarah Ladipo sent in, and that you see here that she performed with others at her school for Black History Month. So Joshua, what does this video tell you or brings about for you?
Well, as a professor, I'm excited and I want to go teach at Ohio State and be part of the movement there. But it also reminds me that all human rights are interconnected. And that's really what they were looking at when they drafted them in 1945 and 1948. And it was also that everyone has a responsibility to one another. But if people aren't standing up and coming to assist in doing the right thing, that's why you have the freedom of thought, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of protest, the freedom of assembly. All those rights, in a way, create the tools that we need to change our society. And I think there's so much actually with that. It's a whole presentation. But the other one that comes up, it makes me think as well, as during this COVID crisis, the whole world was able to sit, and we weren't busy, we weren't distracted by other things, but for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we saw a life being taken away. And no matter who you are, you knew how wrong that was, and then how that was really an abrogation of everything that anyone should exist on earth for. And everyone came up and rose up. And I remember in Hawaii, 10,000 people marching, 10,000 that weekend afterwards. And it was everyone there. You had Black Lives Matter on surfboards. You had people go out and surf and make a circle. And it was that standing in solidarity that all lives must be respected and Black Lives Matter, and that we must use all of our human rights to make sure that everyone has human rights. And if anyone's rights are denied, all of our rights are denied. And if you don't have that sense of solidarity, you're missing the entire purpose of human rights. It is that aspect that is so crucial, and knowing that we're in this struggle together. And if you do not stand up every time something happens, you are not worthy of the human rights we're trying to fight for, and we must be dedicated to that. And of course, it's been of course, that was my first thing. Most people know me now as like UPR, and he organizes these things. At one of the recent UPRs, we also had the youth come for where Michael Brown was murdered, and they did the Fist of Solidarity. And it was amazing because it was at the UN, where protest usually doesn't happen. And even there, fortunately, the government said, don't do anything and don't bother them, because that is the First Amendment right that they have. So I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think there's two sides, right? One is direct action and one is diplomacy. And when I was in college, like they were, I was doing the direct action a lot more with Ruckus Society and teaching how to shut down a city. And we're focusing on the Battle of Seattle and, you know, nonviolent protest. And the amazing part is how powerful it is. It really is a tool that we must all embrace. And I think if you look at those tools of direct action plus our civil and political rights with the right to vote, we're moving in the direction of what the words of the UDHR as well as the Constitution say, but we all have to work on it with everything we have.
Thanks, Joshua. And turning to you, Grace, what does the video evoke for you?
Right, I totally agree with Joshua that this video and all the protests that have been happening this year really shows the power and importance of making your voice heard and sharing your experiences and opinions. And I think there's been a lot of focus, and rightly so, on change at the domestic level, but there's also been response from the international level and from the UN as well. And one bright spot of that was during the June session of the Human Rights Council, which was, of course, directly on the back of the death of George Floyd and really gripping our nation and the world. There was a call from 600 NGOs in the US to have the council really address systemic racism and police brutality much more clearly. And even UNA signed on to that letter too, I know. And that was also echoed by a call from the African group in the council calling for an urgent debate. So there was an urgent debate that was held on systemic racism worldwide. And that was actually only the 5th urgent debate in 14 years. So actually pretty monumental. And the debate featured a lot of powerful voices from the UN system, including the Deputy Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur on Racism, but also voices from NGOs in the US, and even the brother of George Floyd was there. So really powerful from top to bottom, coming out against these racially motivated human rights violations and really calling to end systemic racism and police brutality. And so out of that debate, there was then a resolution that actually mandated the High Commissioner to develop a full report on systemic racism worldwide. And recently, the High Commissioner also asked civil society for their input to their report. And I know that UNA recently contributed to that through a consultation with their members, really getting some grassroots perspectives on what the High Commissioner should be recommending to states on how to really address systemic racism, and also sharing some really moving firsthand stories and experiences about those affected. So I think it just goes to show that the voices of those protesting against racial discrimination are not going unheard, and they're really reaching people at the highest levels of power, not only domestically, but internationally as well. And it's really leading to a response and real action to advance change.
Thanks, Grace. And in moving to our next piece, this one is, you see here on your screen, Lift All Voices, Jennifer Cawley, who I believe is on here. I saw her mention in the chat box. So this is actually a mixed media collage with old documents, torn canvas, beeswax, graphite, and egg tempera painting. Lift All Voices addresses Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights regarding freedom of expression. So she mentions voices of marginalized and oppressed are often uttered, and silencing these voices is a human rights violation. So taking a look at this mixed media collage, Grace, let's start with you. They look like speech bubbles to me, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say and to provide some real world examples.
Yeah, thanks, Farah. I think that just as there's a lot of different mediums going on in this art piece, which is so beautiful, I think it also speaks to a lot of different people of different backgrounds and of diverse opinions and voices, and really fostering an environment that makes people feel safe to express their voices and opinions. But unfortunately, as many of you probably have seen or know, civic space around the world is really under threat, and people around the world are oppressed and don't feel like their voices can be heard. Actually, there was a recent report by an NGO called Civicus, and they found that only 3% of people live in countries where their governments respect civic freedom. So that's pretty stark. And we've seen a lot of countries that have instituted really repressive laws that limit freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, also freedom of the media. And a lot of those have also come out during COVID under the guise of health measures and reducing people in public places. But we've seen that have a really detrimental effect on these freedoms and on human rights, and also leading to a lot of reprisals against human rights defenders and violence and intimidation against them. But this is actually a really high priority of the Secretary General, and he released a call to action on human rights earlier this year, and that really identified civic space as one of the key areas for action that the UN is going to take. And it really highlighted the fact that a shrinking civic space really leads to an overall deterioration of human rights. So definitely something that the UN system is committing to. And in the call to action, they mentioned that they're really increasing support to local grassroots organizations to help protect civic space in local areas and respond to these different laws in different countries. And they're also using their teams in country who really know the situation to work with local civil society organizations and try to enhance civic space. And then also, I think one of the best things I've seen come out of COVID, and kind of a silver lining to all of this, is that it's allowed civil society organizations from all across the world to start to really participate more in UN bodies and UN discussions, and really allow more voices to be heard through digital technology that we might not have before when everyone had to be in person. So it's been really great to see an emphasis on that more, and really integrating more diverse voices into different solutions and policy making, but also overall promoting civic space and making sure it's protected across the UN's agendas.
Great, thanks, Grace. And knowing that we're getting short on time and we have another piece or two to take a look at, Joshua, do you have some brief reactions that you want to mention?
I'll be brief. I think it definitely talks also about the special procedures, the independent experts, the special rapporteurs, and the working groups, and their important role. And I think it's exciting to know that there's 44 of them on all these themes, and that they really could be the eyes and ears around the world. So we don't have to wait to a UPR, Universal Periodic Review. They're available all the time, and they do an amazing job at being the voice of people around the planet. And also, as Grace pointed out, coming up with an urgent debate or actually having a special session, it shows that we, the people, can stand up and put pressure on to make sure that the UN can be accountable on these human rights imperatives if it's not getting enough. But I also thought I was pretty hungry, because when you said beeswax and egg tempura, I started thinking of food, and I started thinking of the World Food Program since they won the Nobel Peace Prize today. But I'll stop there. So
absolutely. Again, a very, very creative approach to interpretation. So moving to our next piece. This is a poem that is read aloud by our very own Jillian Wilson, entitled "Oh Say Can You See?"
Oh Say Can You See by Aspen Bernath Plaisted. Oh say can you see just what we have neglected? For we did not follow through with the forefathers' attempts to include all of us in a life that is free, where each can pursue in the quest for the words that ring true and ring loud, for the life and for liberty and happiness too, that all are allowed, and that must still be true, the bells that keep ringing and singing with hope, from the mountain top high, with a very steep slope that demands to be guarded by us, me and you, against that which erodes all the thoughts and the words that the saintly have spoken, the Buddha and Christ, the shamans, the Pope, and all the pure-hearted most certainly knew. Oh, say can you see that the skies are not clear, and the waters now dying, not safe for the beings that live deep inside them, while children are crying and can't take a breath. As the smokestack stands sturdy, chemicals flow all around, on the ground and the water, taking flight in the air and creating despair. While the bell that is ringing is urgently sending a message that's clear. They must be stopped in their tracks, now, in this moment, not tomorrow or next year. The waters turn brown when the faucets turn on, yet the people are not seen, as they desperately yearn just to quiet their thirst, or to take a good bath. The trees are cut down as orangutans fade from this land where they live, on this earth that was spinning around and now makes a huge jerk. Take a look if you dare, take a look if you care. Let your heart show you visions for what it could be, for you and for me, and all who live here. Feel a lump in your throat that will not be dismissed and will not let you forget as you live in your bliss. See your brothers and sisters all over the world, from ocean to ocean, very deep in the blue, in all shapes and all sizes, and colors and hues. Let us live a new vision with a strong point of view that supports what the bell has been trying to say, and with no division, it might finally ring true.
So Joshua, what do you see with Oh Say Can You See?
I love it when people always take something that they know, so they go, oh, say, can you see? And then change it. And she really, in a way, put the paradigm on its head and flipped that paradigm to make people go like, oh, damn, that's really what we should be seeing, instead of the falsehoods that you remember from a small childhood with that get fed to us. So I think that was the first thing. And then I'll try to be brief because I know we're running close. I also love, though, how she took it not just from the US, but then I was in Sabah, Malaysia, and I remember the story in the newspaper about them taking down the trees and that last orangutan holding on. And it just reminds me, like, we are so blind to pursuing profit and not understanding how every living human being as a spirit, but so do the animals, the two-legged, the four-legged, the two-winged, and indigenous perspectives have so much to teach us. And we're losing it. And when you heard about that orangutan holding on to her baby and trying to still survive with every tree being taken down and people hunting the orangutan, even worse, you're like, what is wrong with humanity? And so it really does ask us to think about really that Gauguin painting, maybe. Where are we from? What are we and where are we going? That three pieces that we really have to think about that, especially on Human Rights Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. And brief remarks do not mean that they are not full and robust remarks. So we appreciate your perspective. And as we move forward, so we featured 7 pieces that both Joshua and Grace discussed, but as we look to continue to celebrate International Human Rights Day today, this December 10th, we've heard and seen from both the gallery of work and from both of the speakers that art and human rights are definitely still indeed intertwined. And as I'm sharing some final remarks, you'll see on the screen some other featured pieces, which are just as excellent and evocative in terms of describing through imagery the UDHR. So in particular, you've heard and maybe learned about the various special rapporteurs whose roles is to encourage member states of the UN to actually critically review their laws, their practices, which impose restrictions on the right to freedom of artistic expression and creativity. So now is the time that you, as an audience member, can actually take action to show your support for human rights and the arts. As you hopefully or likely know, unfortunately, the United States is no longer a member of the Human Rights Council since June 2018. But I would personally venture a guess that if you are watching this program today, it's because you believe in the idea of upholding human rights. So I will ask you if you believe that the United States does indeed need a seat at the table to multilaterally uphold human rights and to continue to remain a part of the discussion worldwide with other member states. Please take out your phones and we have a text to advocate ask for you. And as that's being brought up on the screen, I would ask that, of course, this is just one example of the many actions that you can do to advocate as part of the United Nations Association movement. We are a movement of 20,000 Americans who believe not only in human rights, but in all the values and principles of the United Nations, and strongly believe that it is our duty and our obligation as global citizens to be able to let our members of Congress know how important the UN is to us and how relevant it is to us. And so I would also ask us all to say a special thanks to those artists who submitted their artwork, also those who were not featured today. We very much appreciate and value the time that it took and the strength that it took to want to share your work. And in particular, thank you to those whose work was featured, and thank you for being brave enough to share them with us. And an even more incredible thanks to Joshua Cooper and Grace Anderson. I think this was such an interesting way to talk about human rights, and to also be able to bring in other members of the public to say human rights is important to me for this way or through this way. And we saw some different lenses, and both of you provided such amazing perspectives to look at statues, to look at paintings, to listen to spoken word, that I think that we'll all now walk away with being a little bit of a human rights artist in ourselves. So thank you to everyone who joined us today, and I'm wishing you and yours a happy International Human Rights Day. Take care.